Welcome back to the School of Muscle podcast. Today, Dr. Earp joins me to discuss some of his recent research. And in particular, today we're going to be diving into one of the studies he's done, which I'll make sure is linked below in the description, in which it kind of goes over maybe how your exercise selection might impact some regional hypertrophy changes and some different hypertrophy patterns. So we're going to kind of dive into what he did there for that and kind of some takeaways from that. But a first place I'd like to start here, Dr. Earp, is what kind of led you to want to do this study in the first place here?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So for this study, well, for my lab group in general, we do research focused around improving muscle quality, which is making a muscle function better relative to its size. For athletes, that's a big deal because, if you're a weight class athlete, I was a weightlifter, or if you're just an athlete who has to move your body in general, mass is good. It's the engine that's moving you. But at the same time, it's also added mass you have to overcome. So for sprinting, it's not the biggest bodybuilder who's running. So it's that balance of bigger engine, better performance, but not so big that you're driving around an F-150. For this study, we're looking for this line of research. We're focused around intramuscular adaptations or intramuscular hypertrophy. So that means hypertrophy along the length of a muscle. Arnold Schwarzenegger in what was that document?
Pumping Iron?
Yeah, in the original Pumping Iron, not the new one.
Yep. If I would have missed that, my audience would have killed me for that. So
sometimes I put on the voice, but I'm not doing the voice today. But he said that a bodybuilder views himself as a sculpture. That if you want to put on a little more muscle mass, you go to the gym, you define it, and you put on muscle to redistribute it. To essentially shape your body the same way that a sculpture would add on clay in a certain area. In the bodybuilding community, for a long time, people have known that certain exercises target certain parts of a muscle. For something like the quadriceps that, we kind of say are 4 muscles, but really is about 1.5 muscles. It's more like the triceps than anything else. That you end up being able to or the scientific community has a long time said that if you do exercise, then it just makes the whole muscle bigger, but that's not really the case. Instead, there's this process of intramuscular specialization that along the length of a muscle, every part of that muscle is specialized for certain exercise conditions. Whether it's specialized because it has a certain fiber type, it's more type 2 fiber or type 1 fiber, if it has a certain angulation of the fibers or certain composition or certain bioenergetics or metabolites in there that can fuel certain exercise conditions. Each part of the muscle is specialized for certain tasks along that. And that was what my PhD supervisor, he did the original research in this, and then I kind of took it a little further and said, well, how can we start to actually apply this in an exercise setting, like Arnold did. So we've been doing a number of studies trying to figure out, are there aspects that we can control to change the shape of a muscle, and can we predict those, and does it actually matter? And this study that was funded by the National Strength Conditioning Association, this was really kind of designed to answer those 3 questions.
Awesome. Well, I know that this is right up the alley of most of my listeners are probably interested in physique development, which is, like you said, kind of sculpting their body, adding muscle tissue in different places of the body. And a lot of people, there's where your muscle sits on your body can make a big difference in how your physique looks, as you can overall grow your legs, but if you grow the distal portion of your quads and it's hanging out of your shorts or something, it's going to make you look just more kind of aesthetically large than if the middle of your thigh just hypertrophies a little bit more. So I think this is super interesting. And I know it's kind of the age-old question that a lot of people have had is hey, if I do this quad exercise versus this quad exercise, is it going to grow my teardrop is what a lot of people would call it, opposed to kind of my vastus lateralis or whatever it might be. So I think this is super interesting. And did you have any kind of expectations heading into your study based on maybe some other research? Like, did you think that your guys' study was going to kind of show these differences in regional hypertrophy, or what was kind of like your hypothesis leading into this?
Yeah, good question. Kind of the first thing that I do is it's a little silly, but ESPN used to have their bodies centerfold that they'd have all the athletes of different sports, and one of the things I always try to do, just to kind of refresh myself, is I go around staring at people's legs, and I try to pick what background what kind of sports do they do, what background are they doing. And you kind of get that typical, oh, that person's a cyclist. They have that big teardrop. This person is a sprinter. They have more this funnel shape thigh, and you can actually start eyeing up that to the point where I can kind of go in and guess what exercises you're doing at the gym, or what your favorite exercise is. You don't want to squat. I can see that sometimes. So I mean, that's like the very first thing. And from the sprinter side of thing, proximal muscle mass is a big question, because if you can put on that mass closer to your thigh and you don't have that distal mass, then it's actually easier to swing your leg around. And robotics or prosthetics are doing those designs. Orthotics are focused around that. And even if you go across, there's a interesting study from the Japanese national track team, and they found that where that center mass of the thigh was the strongest anatomical predictor of if you were an elite sprinter or a sub-elite sprinter, if you were sub 10.5 versus sub 11 100-meter dash, all fast, but kind of that last little bit. So I've been very interested in what can get you more of that funnel shaped thigh, or what can, essentially trains that part of the leg. Anecdotally, leg extensions have always kind of been one of those things that people will train to get that teardrop shape. And toe angle and things like that, might go into it as well, that we didn't go into in this study. The pilots, we did a pilot study going into this one where we just looked at regional activation between the proximal and distal part, and what that looked like between open and closed chain exercises. And out of all the exercise conditions that we were going through with this pilot work, we saw about a threefold difference in what the distal activation was during the leg extension, or during the open kinetic chain, so the leg extension, or we actually were doing leg curl versus glute ham raises for that one. But we saw, that this is something that could potentially have a big effect as far as exercise selection goes. Some of the things we've done in the past, like the effects of load, aren't as helpful, because I'm always going to tell people to train any load, like train across the loading spectrum. But as far as just picking an exercise, this was an easy thing of saying, okay, well, you can or can't use, something like a leg extension.
Gotcha. So based on some of your preliminary work, you kind of saw that, hey, there might be a pretty big difference in what muscle, well, for sure is activated, but also may potentially hypertrophy from these different kind of styles of training. Does that sound fair?
Yep, right on.
Perfect. Well, I guess we've kind of covered like the goal of the study and what you're kind of looking to do, as well as kind of your expectations leading in. So now I think we're good to kind of move into the methods of the study and kind of what you guys did. So for the study, what did you guys kind of do here?
Yeah, so this was an interesting study design, because we first had the issue of responders and non-responders to resistance training, which is a big issue when you're talking about finding out small things or finding out things related to hypertrophy. That we've done studies in the past where we've seen people hypertrophy 8% in one study, and in that same group of people, some people hypertrophy 40%, and just that general effect was something that we wanted to control. So what we wanted to do is come up with a different study design that each person would serve as their own control. So they would do open kinetic chain exercise on one leg and closed kinetic chain on the other, or essentially a single leg squat versus a single leg extension. And they did this simultaneously. So, every day they'd come in, they'd do squatting on one leg, they'd do leg extensions on the other, and they'd do that for the entire duration of the study. It was an 8-week study, 3 days a week, so 24 exercise sessions in total. Before and after the study, we measured their strength on both exercises. We also measured what their muscle mass was and their muscle shape using MRI. So we went across the whole length of the thigh, from origin into insertion of the muscle, and then looked at where was that mass changing, and then we took that, added some mathematical models overlaid on top of it to figure out where is the center of mass of that leg. Is it shifting more proximally or distally? Is it all happening around that center and not really changing? And then figuring out how much resistance would this have you do if you were running. Now, we couldn't, ideally we would actually have people running, but since we were doing this within study design, we can't have them run, because then theoretically one leg, as it gets less resistance, would go a little bit faster and they'd start going around in a circle, which is a fun little experiment. If you ever want to look at someone's dominance on their own, have them line up on the sideline of a soccer field, close their eyes and run, and you can start figuring out which leg is a little dominant and spending a little more into the run. So that was the main question around the study. Going beyond that, we also wanted to see if we could predict changes in mass. So we use near-infrared spectroscopy, which is a light absorption method, to look at changes in oxygen saturation in certain parts of the muscle. We use that to determine if the proximal part of the muscle was active or the distal part was more active. And we had them, I think it was their fifth or sixth exercise session that they did. We put these sensors on them. They exercised with it, and we looked at how stressful, or the physiological stress in each part of the muscle within that one session, to see if we could predict the patterns of hypertrophy between the exercises.
It sounds like it was kind of a design in which you had the same individual, they would perform a squat and they would also perform a leg extension, and then they would kind of do that those exercises over the course of, what was the time course of the study again?
8 weeks.
Over the course of 8 weeks. And then you guys were looking at differences in hypertrophy as well as activation and some different measurements there. So I think with that, now we can kind of get to the good stuff here. What did you guys find here?
So we found that the exercises that you picked had a big impact on the overall shape of the muscle, where that mass was distributed. So collectively, we found that leg extensions had a more distal pattern of hypertrophy, so more hypertrophy around the knee. That actually resulted in about a 2.5 centimeter shift in the center of mass of the leg, or of the muscle, distally compared to the squat, which was a slight proximal shift. But between the two exercises, essentially we had that shift in those legs that now all of a sudden they are pretty imbalanced on where that mass is distributed. Putting into our running models, we found that this could contribute to about a 2 to 3% increase, decrease in running economy by having that more distal shift. So it might look good, but it's not where we want mass for sprinting. So for sprinters, leg extensions are something that are activating that aren't quite as ideal for you. And then finally, around the ability to predict these patterns with NIRS, we found that we could predict about 40% of the variation in center of mass between the exercises.
To me, it sounds like your findings kind of align with what you expected a bit heading into it, to where you did see these different patterns of growth between the individuals that did leg extensions versus squat, kind of suggesting that your exercise selection can make a pretty large impact on the different regions of a muscle that grow there.
Yep, pretty much.
Cool. So nothing surprised you from the study. Everything was pretty well kind of in line with your guys' findings. And is this also in line? I'm not sure about the kind of body of evidence on this topic, but was it relatively in line as well with maybe some other literature here, or how did it kind of compare to some of that?
So the intramuscular patterns of hypertrophy is an area that's relatively new. There's probably about 12 studies that are randomized control trials on it. But as far as being able to pick exercises and predict and control, that's a relatively new thing. It's more most of the research is going in saying, well, this results in this and this results in this. But as far as being able to accurately predict, we're kind of surprised on how well that lined up. The one thing that was pretty surprising is based on the muscle activity stuff that we saw going in, we thought that the squat would activate the entire muscle more and result in just a general more hypertrophy in the quads than the leg extension. Because the leg extension, comparing the proximal and distal pattern, it was almost like a light that distal is really active, proximal is not very active at all. A squat, both are active, but the ratio of proximal activity is a lot higher in that one. So we thought we'd get that response, but we originally thought that the squat would just be more overall hypertrophy and just selectively hypertrophy that proximal bit. But it really ended up being that distal, just that most distal hypertrophy that was kind of driving it from the leg extension. Yeah, so that was kind of the biggest surprise that, while we did support our hypothesis, it didn't line up exactly how we thought it would.
No, and that's why you do the studies, I guess, is to kind of get some actual harder evidence for everything. So, no, that's really awesome. And I think that, kind of maybe zooming out into a more of a potential practical takeaway position in which if someone's listening to this, they're probably either mainly focused on building muscle themselves or coaching clients and stuff like that. So do you think that based on kind of this research on regional hypertrophy and exercise selection, what would maybe be some kind of practical takeaways for someone to kind of keep in mind here when it kind of comes to this?
I'd say kind of the biggest thing right now is just pay attention to how your body responds to certain exercises. If you feel that a certain part of the muscle is getting sore after you use a certain exercise, chances are that's because that's actually targeting that part of the muscle. Varying your exercises, just so that you can hit the entire muscle, is always a thing that is really important. If you don't want to get into that stale part where you kind of go back and you do the same 3-4 exercises, we actually, some of our other research in this area is kind of highlighting and doing the similar things in the hamstring. We're finding that some people are actually developing these intramuscular imbalances where part of the muscle is actually really underdeveloped compared to other parts. And we actually think it's just because they're using exercises that are always targeting one part. And we're actually doing a line of research right now to try to predict who's going to, who's at risk for a hamstring injury at a certain part of the muscle, just because that muscle shape starts to change. Muscle's beautiful in that it's the only multinucleated cells in the body, and each of those nuclei within that muscle fiber controls hypertrophy around that myonuclear domain. So, we have all these nuclei. You target certain ones through certain exercise conditions, and that even within an individual fiber, not just a muscle in itself, that the shape of an individual fiber will respond, and to a magnitude that we're only kind of finding how big that application is. I mean, you get to a certain part, all of a sudden that myonuclear domain gets too big and satellite cells will come in, and now you just have more muscle, more nuclei, and that exacerbates and can exponentially change the shape of the muscle, even more than what we initially thought. So pay attention to that. Listen to your body, vary things up as much as you can.
And I think that it's really cool to see research on this, as I feel like several years ago there was kind of the bodybuilding bros. They would be like, okay, you need to do a bunch of different variety in your training to make sure that you're developing the entire muscle and shaping it correctly. And I think that it almost swung back the other way to people kind of said that was a little bit bro science, and then you only really need to do like a bench press, a pulling exercise, and a squat pattern, and you can mostly grow everything. But it sounds like this, while that might be true to some extent, like you could get a good amount of gains with just a handful of exercises, it sounds like that there are some unique benefits to including some exercise variation and making sure that, hey, if you do leg extensions and that distal portion of your quad gets sore, it's probably not just by happenstance. There probably is something to it, and probably something going on there with kind of regional hypertrophy. So does that sound like a fair summary there?
Yep, that sounds good to me.
Awesome. Well, what's next for you? You kind of mentioned that you're looking into some or doing some other research on predicting like hamstring injury based on some of this kind of regional hypertrophy differences and stuff. But what's kind of down the chute for you, and what will be some next stuff that I have you back on kind of cover here in the future?
Yeah, so we're really focused on hamstrings, mainly because it's a localized injury. Our big question is, how do we apply this? What does it actually matter? And because hamstring strains are a localized injury, it's something that we can apply this idea of intramuscular imbalances to predict injury. So we have a study going on this fall with athletics that we're hoping to get around 200 of our D1 athletes to come in and be able to assess what's happening along that muscle, and can we actually figure out who's at risk for an injury and not. That's the main thing. We have another study that we're looking at how some novel exercise conditions, things like blood flow restriction training can affect patterns hypertrophy, and kind of continue on this. We just finished a study looking at joint position on patterns of hypertrophy that we're hoping to get out by the end of the year. So stay tuned for that too.
Yeah, definitely. I know like the regional hypertrophy thing is definitely something that bodybuilders in particular are interested in. And I know that for your probably primary focus is in bodybuilders. It's probably more of the athletic populations, but I know that we'll definitely be staying in tune with kind of what you're doing there. So kind of with that, if someone wants to kind of stay up to date with what you're doing, is there a place that they can kind of follow you online, or where it might be?
Not really.
Not really. Yeah. That is, I have to tell you that I have a lot of like professors and researchers on this podcast discuss their research, and I don't know, 8 times out of 10, they're like, Google Scholar, ResearchGate, and that's about it.
Yeah, our research group, the Sports Optimization and Rehabilitation Lab at UConn, we have a Twitter account that some of the grad students manage. So I don't actually know what goes on there, but yeah, other than the ResearchGate is probably the main thing that
I will for sure be paying attention to that, and then if I see some other stuff on, I'll make sure to try to get you back on. So if there's a little bit of a platform for your kind of research, and at least in the bodybuilding circles, I know we'll be definitely interested in that. So thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Earp. I definitely learned a ton about your study, and I think that having you on to actually talk about it and provide a little bit more context definitely provides a lot of value, other than a lot of people just reading the abstract or something like that. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.